So the whole baby boomer versus millennial narrative is extremely confused. The various sides kind of take a wide variety of positions that are often kind of schizophrenic. And I think that kind of shows the breakdown of traditionally what's considered left right in Western countries in the aftermath of the financial crisis. Because what we saw in the aftermath of the financial crisis is the right started to move away from corporatism, away from kind of unregulated free markets and big business, and the left kind of wholly embraced these things. Like Occupy Wall Street, in my view at least, became very pro bank in the aftermath, where the Tea Party and kind of what eventually became the dissident right is very opposed to those kind of things. And kind of how you react to work culture, social issues, etc., really kind of colors your view on this. So before we go into my opinion, let's just talk about a couple different ways people see the gap, because I find people tend to be very partisan one way or another about the issue. Some people take kind of a plague on both your houses approach, but generally speaking, those people blame the baby boomers for doing a really bad job raising millennials. So, kind of the social justice warrior position is millennials are good, baby boomers are bad. And as I said in the past, social justice warriors take the view that the failure to achieve real equality in our lifetime is because the baby boomers didn't live up to any of the things they said they would. They eventually, as they got older, they used drugs less. They kind of abandoned free love in favor of a more traditional family. A lot of them still opted for the white picket fence, the 9 to 5 job, stay at home moms, all kind of those more traditional family structure, while the whole time espousing values that were completely at odds with their behavior. A lot of them still live in their white gated communities, etc. And there is, I think they are kind of correct in saying there is the preference within them that their kids not be gay, their kids not be drug addicts, their kids not sleep around a bunch, their kids not marry someone of another racial group. I think that preference is very clearly there, but it's opposed to what they advocate publicly and what they vote for. So they have kind of this very schizophrenic view. So I think the left, the social justice warriors, the far left by and large despises them. The center left is kind of schizophrenic once again, because what happened in the aftermath of the financial crisis is you had a great realignment where, traditionally speaking, in Western countries, the right, as we call it, was very much unregulated capitalism. Corporations are good. The rape and pillage of the environment is good. The banks can do no wrong, etc. But within the context of the financial crisis, we saw the Tea Party emerge and kind of the populist right that was very much against those kind of things, and kind of realized they were being played by corporations, and that corporations were not conservative and were extremely socially liberal and economically liberal. But we'll talk about that another time. Economically, like left wing in the traditional sense. I think the concept of economic left and economic right is very flawed, but it's generally speaking what's used and people understand what it means. So I'm just going to use that for the sake of this video and most videos when I'm talking about the whole thing. So my point is the right as we know it became increasingly anti-globalist, anti-corporation, anti-big bank, etc. Whereas the left became in favor of all of these. So like within when I used to go to university, which was only like 10 years ago, the left was very pro nationalism, and they hated globalism. They hated multinational companies. And now, if you notice, they love these things. They love the big banks. Occupy Wall Street at the end completely abandoned left wing populism and just embraced corporatism in all its forms. Hipsters are like the most capitalistic, corporatist people on earth. The center left, I find, just hates labor now. They hate organized labor. They hate workers' rights. They're on board with the whole unpaid overtime, treating your workers like dirt, firing people because of their personal behavior. They view workers' rights as anathema. And so they take kind of I find a more anti-millennial view, kind of the center left, because they view millennials as being lazy and entitled, because millennials feel hard done by, because they won't get things like pensions or benefits or frankly a living wage, and they can't afford to like have families or anything. And I find the center left will just attack them over that. And the center right is very similar, although the center right tends to be more critical of baby boomers because of the whole, I guess, more kind of libertarians. Libertarians tend to hate baby boomers because of the spending orgy they have. The far right, I find, tends to be more anti baby boomer for the cultural revolution that they brought in. But within all these groups, you have schizophrenic, like I said, kind of bipolar views where some people are 100% against one group, some people are 100% against the other group. And I just kind of wanted to talk about how I viewed the issue and the kind of the difference of behavior between the two. So I think the defining feature of the baby boomer is very high time preference, a preference for style over substance, and an unwillingness to commit to the things that they publicly espouse. And it kind of clicked for me because my parents are remodeling their basement. And I've said in the past, I really love my parents. I think they did a great job raising me and my sibling. But it's very frustrating because they are baby boomers. So, like, when we were remodeling the basement, we have all this old furniture, and the furniture is disgusting. It's probably full of mites. It's like 30 years old. It hasn't been well kept. And when we were remodeling, I'm like, why don't we just throw it out? And they're like, Argent, it's too expensive to just throw it out. We can't afford that. I'm like, well, but you guys can afford to go on a trip every month. We can afford to spend probably $4,000 or $5,000 a year landscaping the trees on our lawn. Why don't you just not do that one time and get rid of this crap? You've been complaining about this for the last 30 years. Like, no, we can't spend that money. It's too difficult. We don't have any income. And I find this is very true, baby boomers. In particular, the thing that I find exemplifies everything wrong with the baby boomer frame of mind is random trips to like the Caribbean or any kind of trip to a place that there's no kind of enriching aspect. There's nothing cultural about it. There's nothing historical or really interesting about it. But rather than kind of go to Florida or some affordable tropical place, they'll try to go to some like exotic place like Costa Rica or the Dominican Republic or something, and they'll just stay on the resort the whole time. They'll talk about how they went to an exotic place, even though they didn't actually interact with the locals and they didn't leave their reservation, as it were. And they will spend money on that even if they don't enjoy it because they have to show off to other people. Status signaling is extremely important for baby boomers. In a lot of cases, lawns are the next big thing where they'll spend untold amounts of money landscaping, cutting trees, hiring people to do fancy stuff with their lawns. They will spend more money on that than they will on like the inside of their house. Even like they'll let their roofs fall apart, but God forbid their lawn isn't perfect, and they'll do unnecessary things. But something to keep in mind out, especially if you live in suburbia, you'll notice they're constantly landscaping. So my parents have money to do that and to go on like trips to random places, but they don't have money like to spend a couple $100s to get rid of the furniture in the basement. That is unaffordable. And like I said, this is something I noticed with baby boomers. They tend to hoard like crazy. Pretty much every baby boomer I've ever met is a hoarder. They won't get rid of stuff even if they won't use it. Um, they aren't really like, they don't even need to replace it. They can just get rid of it. It's better sometimes to have no furniture than to have mite infested pieces of crap. But it's just something they won't do. And the greatest generation, so called, is also like this. I don't find millennials are like this at all. Probably because they tend to live in smaller environments. They have a much more minimalistic lifestyle in terms of how much stuff they own. So let's move on to kind of millennials. And the baby boomers also took this perspective when they were running government, where they voted themselves all this money for social programs, public works, etc., but they weren't willing to pay the taxes to support it, and they weren't willing to have the large families that would have to pay it off. They had like the one or two designer kids at the age of 30 or 40, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with having neutral population growth, provided you don't have mass immigration. Eventually, the birth rate will recover once the cost of living goes down. I mean, that's just kind of the way it works, but they ran up this massive debt that they passed off to a generation they couldn't bother having because they were too busy spending all their money on an orgy of conspicuous consumption. So they wouldn't pay through taxes, and they wouldn't uh, get a produce a future generation to handle it either. So that's kind of the scenario that they were left with. So the view of millennials is that they're children. They never grow up. They don't get married. They don't have kids. They spend all their money on stuff from Think Geek and like fancy food, etc. Now I'm going to do something because, as people know, my flaw is and my strength is I'm excessively fair, even when I shouldn't be. But I'm going to try to defend this behavior. The issue with millennials and why they spend their money on like nerdy stuff or like special editions or things or kind of what I define as cool stuff is because it doesn't really matter if they didn't buy it. The cost of living in urban areas is so high that even if you make like 70, 80 grand in Toronto, you're probably not going to be able to afford anything more than like a bachelor apartment. Unless you're already established and you have rent control, or you've bought a house like 30 years ago and the housing market's massively increased beyond the rate of inflation and you've paid it off, then you're okay. Your salary is probably left over from the era of relatively higher salaries, proportionate to inflation. They were higher. You probably have a lot bigger benefits. You have a pension to look forward to. You don't have to save as much money for the future. And for millennials, like the cost in an urban area, and people say, well, just go to a rural area. Well, there's not jobs in rural areas for a lot of people. Agriculture is very mechanized. They use cheap labor from the third world, anyways, and there aren't factory jobs anymore. So there's not really a working class as we used to know it. So millennials normally have to move into white collar fields if they want to earn a living. And people say, why don't you go into blue collar fields? Because in the case of Canada, they just import those people from the third world. And you can't compete with people who spend a couple $100s to get an education and come in. And it's kind of a race to a bottom because they come from a third world country, so they're used to a much lower standard of living. And like the response, particularly kind of from the center left and the center right, is millennials should just accept the lower standard of living and try to live like the people from the third world country. It's like, why should we abandon the higher standard of living we have in our countries? Like it's for what end? Just like it doesn't even make sense. It's like, well, you're self-indulgent for wanting to enjoy a similar standard of living to your parents, but we couldn't be bothered to have children, so we're going to import people from the third world to be the children that we refuse to have. And like I said, it's a race to a bottom. They dramatically lower wages and living standards because they're willing to endure much worse stuff than people in Western countries. And it's like, well, you just have to stop being self. And well, why? Why are we doing this? Why can't millennials enjoy the standards of living that have taken centuries to build? Why do we have to start this race to the bottom in terms of labor laws? So if you're a millennial, you want to go into blue collar trades, that's not very easy. If you want to go into STEM, you have all these people from the third world who spent like $1,000 at like India Polytechnic, Vishnu school or Ganesha school, and you can't compete with that. It's very difficult. So, between the absurdly high cost of living, the loss of jobs to mechanization, the inability to compete with mass imports from the third world, millennials often just all they have to look forward to, unless they're very lucky, like if they, etc., is they get their one room apartment and they buy a lot of stuff because it doesn't really matter. I mean, if you let's say you need $100,000 to raise a child decently within an urban center, does it really matter if $20,000 or $40,000 a year? No, it doesn't, because either way, it's nowhere near affordable for you. So if you're making $40,000, you might as well spend the money on yourself and try to enjoy your life, because the traditional aspirations are out of reach. So, like, what's kind of the point of scrimping and saving for something you're never going to be able to afford, anyways? So, you might as well buy your toys. You might as well try to have some fun, because there's not a, like, it's just the picket fence is just never going to happen. At least, probably not in your lifetime. So, what's the point of living like a complete monk? And even then, their standards of living are still much lower in terms of their houses, etc., than baby boomers will ever be. So it's like, why live on hot dogs and like canned tuna? Like, in a lot of cases, it's not even fancy stuff. It's just prices are much higher now than they have been historically. So why not buy like the multi-grain bread, or like the nice fish, the or make yourself a souffle or something? It's just like, enjoy your life a bit. I'm not talking about like hedonism or anything, but just if you want to have a big screen TV or a high quality computer or something, then you might as well just buy it. You're not going to be able to afford to raise a kid anyways, unless it's in like a really, and I think a lot of them, even if they want to have kids, they don't want to just, let's say they could afford the bare minimum for their kid, like living in some like roach infested basement or whatever. They just don't want to bring up a kid in those circumstances. They want to bring up a kid in a similar way to how they were raised, and there's nothing wrong with that, and that's not irrational, and that's not an immoral thing to believe in. But another thing with millennials is, for most of human history, a lot of your money in your life comes from inheritance. Pretty much no one I know has received a large inheritance from their parents. Generally speaking, they spend all their money before they die, and they sometimes leave debts left over. So like, you don't even get the family home. The family home is mortgaged. Near the end of their lives, baby boomers, I find, have an orgy of spending. Well, they'll just go on as many trips as possible. Like, my grandparents have spent all their savings going on cruises that they don't enjoy. They never get off the ship, but they'll spend like $9,000 several times a year to go on a cruise. And there's no concern for the next generation. One of my aunts recently died, and she left 95% of her money to charity. She left no money whatsoever to her descendants or to other members of her family, because she regarded that as being immoral when she could virtue signal and give it to other people. Like, historically, that was how people got established. That's what a dowry is. A dowry is the woman's piece of the inheritance. That is, like, imagine if like monarchies worked like that. Like, the father deliberately mortgaged every asset in the kingdom and spent every penny, and then left the son to deal with the mess, which is what occasionally happened, but that led to the collapse of kingdoms. I think that's what happened with like France or whatever. But that people just don't inherit anymore, even if it's just the house or whatever. It's, I probably won't get an inheritance. My parents probably won't get an inheritance. My parents got large inheritances. My grandparents got huge inheritances, but it's just not a thing anymore. The idea of leaving money to your children for like 90% of human history, actually 99% of human, was seen as kind of the ideal, but that's not a thing anymore. Millennials are lazy and entitled if they expect that. So they can inherit the collective wealth of future generations, blow it on conspicuous consumption, and that's okay. But if millennials want to buy the occasional big screen TV or take the occasional trip to Europe, that's bad. That's unacceptable. So like I said, millennials are just like, I'm kind of screwed either way, so why live like a monk? And I'm very sympathetic to that point of view. I myself am a prodigious saver. I bank as much money as I can. I do buy things like video games. I have a good computer, etc. But aside from taking a sizable trip every now and again, I try to invest as much money as I can for the future. But that's more so just because I like to have money. Not so much in a greedy way, but it's nice to be able to sleep at night knowing you have a ton of cash stocked away in case something happens. And so, like, if you want to take that, go out for a meal, you want to maybe buy a couple extra video games, you want to buy maybe a nicer coat, you have the cash there to do it. But I'm not going to pretend, regardless of how much I save, I doubt I'll ever have the money to have a family. And a lot of millennials get married and they don't have children, because if they get married they can maybe afford like a 1 bedroom apartment, or maybe, god forbid, a 2 bedroom apartment, but they don't really have cash left to raise a kid. And I know lots of people do it, but once again, why should they be forced to accept a much worse financial condition and much worse just lifestyle than their parents did for no reason? I don't think that's reasonable. I don't think it's fair. Anyways, guys, so I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll talk to you guys later.